thinking, but also the way the scientific research goes, and particularly in terms of ethical considerations. And so, in a lot of cases, there, the idea that science can do research, science can look at new ideas, but also whether it's right for them to pursue those ideas. And one of the things that a lot of people, when they first understand what science is about and first start looking at it, is this idea that they think science is all about getting the greater good. And so it's something that, just tries to develop new ideas. These new ideas lead to new ideas, and it gets more, people get a better understanding of what the world around us is like. However, there are massive influences that decide which avenue science goes down. In some cases, original ideas may lead to a new idea itself, or it may not take off. In some cases, science operates in this model where if the idea isn't accepted, it doesn't go anywhere. And again, in the end, science is just influenced by the way humans think. Science is being done by humans, and so it can sometimes be to our detriment if we don't follow the ideas as we want. And so when we're looking here, we're thinking contemporarily. So what's currently influencing the way we think? And one of the biggest things in the modern, and particularly the modern Western society, is that economics has a massive influence. Modern science has to be economically viable in a lot of cases. So universities, where most people would consider most of the research comes from, a lot of that research isn't basic science. It's about trying to find economic uses, because institutions like universities or biotech companies want to get money from that. And of course, one of the things there as well is that it's also in Western society, it's only a relatively recent thing that people could go to university without having to pay huge amounts of money. And so up until probably the mid-20th century, people who went to university were people who could afford to. Now, in places like America, that's still pretty much the case. In Australia, there's things like the HEX scheme, where you can defer those payments and you don't have to pay for all of it. And this is something that's relatively new. Previously, some of the oldest universities in the world, like Oxford and Cambridge, they were expensive to go to, and you couldn't go to them unless you were rich, or unless you could find a rich sponsor. And so, in general, people who were considered poorer didn't necessarily go to those jobs. And there are examples of people who broke through that, but it was definitely the exception. And of course, as we've just said there, one of the things there I did mention briefly, that a lot of modern science has to be economic. Now, one example that you can pull up that isn't necessarily directly making an impact is the Large Hadron Collider. Now, it's the world's biggest experiment ever conducted. It's also the most expensive. And what it has come about is because a lot of European countries just agreed that it was a good thing to try and do. But it is undertaking basic research, and its most famous experimental result up until 2021 is, of course, discovering the Higgs boson, which is was a theoretical particle related to why particles have mass. And it's very expensive. It costs, I believe, about $1 billion a year to run. It cost approximately $50 billion US to create. And one of the things there, this is also, it was agreed that it was a good thing to help us understand the nature of the universe and the nature of matter. And I think part of the hope for that as well is that even though it's very expensive and it's doing a lot of very basic research, that eventually that basic research will lead to new technologies, and those new technologies will in themselves be quite profitable in the long run. And of course, one of the things there is that people do consider that spending on things like science while it might be expensive, has positive benefits. A report done by the Office of the Chief Scientist in cooperation with the Australian Academy of Science in 2015 highlighted how science has a positive impact on the economy. And it's a really important thing to keep in mind because it's historically a lot of governments like to reduce the amount of money on science because they think that it's more popular to put money into different things or promote mining and things like that. But when you look at the numbers, science helps a great deal. When you look directly at some of the economic activity, at the time, 11% of the economy was directly related to physical and mathematical sciences. You had almost 1 million people, 7% of the employable population directly employed and directly generating $74 billion and including a huge amount of export dollars. And when you also then go to indirect things, so while there might be 7% of the population directly employed, there's 22%, a huge number of people there, and so their numbers actually increase, and that's people supplying stuff for that part of the economy, including people who work there, maybe cleaners, things like that, suppliers, and that there. So when you look at it, the amount of money that comes from science that helps the Australian economy is huge. And it's interesting, particularly that politicians like to promote things like mines and that as an Australian export. When, if you look there, the number of people employed in mines is really small compared to the number of people directly or indirectly working in scientific fields. So it's something that politicians in the future might want to consider, that while mining does bring a lot of money into the country, is that money going to be beneficial, or is that economic activity beneficial in the long term? And of course, a lot of the science in Australia is overseen by the CSIRO, the Commonwealth Science and Research at the body, and things like Wi-Fi were developed by CSIRO. There's also other private companies like Cochlear, which developed the bionic ear, a way of treating or allowing people who are profoundly deaf to hear and improve their quality of life. And this is the thing, Australia is very good at developing these ideas, and that means that money from those ideas is coming back into Australia. And there is the potential for things like biotech companies to use Australia for research. And particularly in medicine, we've got a very good track record of things being developed and helping the world, including things like cervical cancer vaccines. And they've improved people's qualities of life, but also brought money into the Australian economy. And that potentially is much, much bigger than any mining interests, which only have a finite lifetime, but eventually will run out. Now, of course, I've mentioned a couple of times there that politics has a huge influence on that. CSIRO, while it is about science, is a government organisation. And so politics has a massive impact on that there. Politics can direct where money is going. But politics also has an influence on the way research is regulated. And part of their role is to develop guidelines, to develop rules. And over the last 50 years, or you can even go back further and sort of talk about post-World War II, where we've got such a better understanding, particularly in the biological sciences, there's a couple of big ideas there. One is the use of stem cells, and the other on animal testing. Now, animal testing in Australia, for the most part, is banned. There are some facilities available for that, but it's under very, very strict guidelines. But stem cells, the use of stem cells has been controversial for a long period of time, and particularly the idea of using embryonic stem cells. And there was a lot of debate in the early days of the COVID vaccines because some of the treatments were tested on embryonic stem cell lines that go back to the 1980s. And of course, because this is all governed by politicians, and particularly in Australia, politicians usually have a 3 or a 4 year election cycle. And so in many cases, they're just thinking about 3 or 4 years ahead. It's very hard in particularly Western politics. It's not just Australian, it's American, and in the United Kingdom and a lot of the European countries. Politicians often get fixated on, is this going to affect me in the next 3 years? Not, is this a good idea for 30 years' time? And of course, politics as well is influenced by money. And I suppose it is a sad indictment on Australian and Western politics that politicians, when they're thinking of their electoral cycle, need money to advertise. And so one of the biggest ones here, and this is more an American example here, is the link between smoking and cancer. Tobacco companies had a lot of money, and what they were able to do, particularly in the US, was talk to Congress, and they confused the issue. I'm not going to cast aspersions on all politicians, but a lot of politicians are not necessarily the smartest tools in the shed, and they will, take political donations. And, the Western system allows that, and they'll take a donation from a tobacco company or say, well, look, here's the research that shows smoking doesn't cause cancer. They won't tell the politician that the company is the one that made the research up and paid a doctor a lot of money, which influenced that research. But, they'll get in there and they'll have some big diagrams and they'll have pretty graphs, which quite easily confuse a lot of people. And of course, here is just a very short little animation which will show you that, since 2000, smoking rates have gone down, and so have lung cancer rates. So that's a pretty simple way of showing that that there is a link, and that health-wise, as smoking rates go down, lung cancer rates go down. And of course, we also have our most modern debate that's hugely influenced by politics, which is climate change. Now, you can go back and look that, some scientists were discussing climate change in the mid-1800s. Climate change is not a new idea. The effect of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and on the global systems is not a new idea. That was way back in the 1800s. And of course, one of the things that energy companies have done, particularly oil companies, are some of the richest companies on the planet. And they've taken the ideas from the smoking debates of the 70s, 80s, and so on, and used those same ideas. Most climate scientists agree that burning of fossil fuels has a change. Carbon dioxide levels have gone up. Temperatures have gone up. But what the oil companies and their subsidiaries have done is, paid some climate scientists to say, well, no, it's not as bad, it's there. And so one of the things that happens in a lot of debates is that both sides are heard. Even if 99% of people agree on one side and the 1% that don't aren't necessarily using the best data, or they're cherry picking little bits of data there. And so what this does with voters and general people in society is it gets them confused, and because they're seeing both sides of the argument there. Data, most people who look at the climate change data will agree it is a concern. And part of this as well is it's very easy to manipulate data. Now, this is just a very simple look at climate data, monthly maximum temperature. And it's going all the way back to the mid-1800s. One of the things there, the Bureau of Meteorology does have data going back a very, very long period of time. And so you can look at that here. And this is just the monthly maximum temperature. And if you look, okay, from 1859 down to the left to 1879, it seemed to plateau. Didn't seem to be much difference in that there. And then you sort of get to 1899, get to the start of the 20th century, and there is an increase. And there's a gradual increase. And then you look to 1999, that increase is increasing. So there definitely appears to be an acceleration. You're going from sort of an average of about 21 to almost 23. And one of the things that also is easy to muddy the waters with is that 1 or 2 degrees doesn't seem much. But over time, that can have massive effects on ecosystems. And what often people do is that they'll look at the data in very small amounts. So on the left there, you've got the late 1800s where the average temperature appeared to be going down. But then you compare that to the 2000s where it's definitely going up. Now, of course, one of the things that people will say is that, oh, well, there's the short term doesn't represent, or that there's been plateaus. And so if they looked at the 1970s data, the 1970s data might suggest that there's a plateau, but there was also a world oil crisis. You might say that in 1950 it appeared to plateau, and that's because there was a worldwide sort of slight depression because of the end of World War II and the fact that there was a lot of death and destruction after that. And so by putting those things in there, it's very easy to make it hard to understand. And of course, in the 2019 budget, climate change, or 2019 election, climate change became a bit of an issue. But again, the politicians on either side were, saying a lot of things, and politicians will say things and they're trying to confuse people. And that causes the problem. And of course, one of the problem is that there's also, not only is there internal national issues, but there's global cooperation and global issues. So climate change has become it is a global issue, and most governments agree to try and reduce that because they see that in the long term it's going to cause massive problems. And as it says there, domestic issues can also greatly do that, because what can happen is that if a slightly poorer country has to take global action, then they may lose out on money less than than the larger countries. But you've also got there that there's other things. The end of World War II was precipitated by the dropping of 2 nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Part of that, and one of the people involved in that, was Albert Einstein, who, as a Jewish person in Germany, was ostracized and went to the United States and convinced the Americans to build a nuclear bomb because he knew that the Germans were doing that. What nobody really knew at the time was the Germans were really not developing it as fast as they thought, but the Americans were able to pour a lot of money in and develop that bomb, which caused the Cold War of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and probably even generating now into the 21st century. But there are also other examples. We mentioned the Large Hadron Collider before. Mainly a lot of money coming from European countries. And they all agreed that this project, one, would generate a lot of economic activity, but potentially and generate a lot of scientific ideas, but potentially down the track would generate a lot of new science or a lot of new technology out of that. Another big one is of the International Space Station, which not even across Europe, across North America, across Russia. As I mentioned before, the Cold War, and so the Americans and Russians were at each other's throats. In the mid or second part of the 21st century, they seem to be engaged in another Cold War. Japan, again, enemies from the Second World War, though America and Russia in the Second World War were allies against the Germans. But all these countries have agreed that something like the International Space Station is good, one, for international relations, but it is also good for some fundamental research. And developing these technologies allows countries to develop new technologies. One of the also big things in modern science is this idea of human experimentation. Now, in the post-COVID world, human experimentation, human trials were needed to ensure that the vaccine was able to be developed and to try and eradicate or eliminate the harsh symptoms of the COVID outbreak. And this is something that happened less than a year, which normally takes 10 to 20 years. Normally, drug development takes a very long time because not every drug has a positive impact. And so it's done slowly and methodically to ensure that there's minimal harm. And eventually, though, humans do need to be part of that. And the important thing here, and this is a really important ethical consideration, is that anyone who is involved in a drug trial knows the potential, or they know what potentially could go wrong. If someone isn't informed of that and something does go wrong, that would mean that there's a massive issue and that they could take legal action potentially there. So in most cases there, you do need to be over 18, you do need to be able to give legal consent. It is rarer for children to be involved in trials, but in that case there, their parents have to give them consent. Also, as briefly mentioned before, animal experimentation. It's been banned in Australia for a number of years. There are some facilities which do things like primate trials, but they're very rare and only in certain cases, and they have to be very, very careful with their ethics. And, it is basically cosmetic testing. So you used to get rabbits and put eyeliner on them or do this or do that to them. Quite not something that can be done now. And I think part of the reason as well is that there's not really much you can get from putting lipstick on a rabbit that you can't just get from other types of testing. And of course, any time that animals are used, the overarching philosophy of this, and this is something that goes back several decades, is that animals aren't unduly suffering from that. There are times where animals or things will die from the test and that there, but the main thing is that the animal is not suffering or unduly suffering. Another interesting thing, and this is a relatively new thing, is this idea of biobanks. Now, the idea that biological samples can be used for research, and it goes back to sort of the late 20th century. And so particularly when people could have their DNA sequenced. And so one thing, you could actually keep a sample of your DNA. But also you've got there things like blood samples, semen samples, just cell samples in general that can be kept at these biobanks and used for research later. There's also examples in where things like seed banks, where samples of seeds are taken and held for further research there. And one of the things that comes from this as well is that if you give a biological sample, maybe you give a blood test and that's kept online, or in the end, who owns that if you've signed a disclaimer? It's also a thing with in the last 10 to 20 years where people have willingly got sent samples off to get their DNA tested and to assess their ancestry, or it's been used for a number of years in paternity cases about who is the father of a child or something like that. And there is a lot of debate about, if you send off your DNA, who owns that? Can police use that DNA that's stored? And it's a lot of new ethical considerations that no one's ever had to think about before. And of course, if you do give that as well there, it's not all bad. It's There can be positive, as long as it's done with consent, or it's done without identifying characteristics. And so, if you can quite easily look at a DNA sample, test something on it, then there's positive impacts. And ethics is also, it's about weighing the positives and the negatives together. And of course, there's a lot of research data as well. There's a thing like biohacking. Can someone take your information and use it for something else? Could they actually even take your DNA and leave it at the scene of a crime or something like that? Who makes money from your DNA? And particularly in cases like if you go to some of those genetic testing companies to find out your ancestry, if that company goes bankrupt, that company closes down, and another company takes it over, does that new company own your DNA? And of course, this idea of genetics and that is brand new as well. A lot of countries aren't really dealing with that there. And that's what we said there. Like, if a company has your DNA and the police want to use it, can they? And is that legal? And even if it becomes legal, is that ethical? And of course, in Australia, there are a whole range of different codes and guidelines that are designed to guide people when they're doing research. And part of the problem with this, though, is that because the technology changes so quickly, these policies often don't cover new technologies. So even when it comes to genetically changing something with the CRISPR technology that's popped up in the last few years, that is science that's ahead of the curve as it comes to regulation and potential, genetically modifying organisms and that there as well. Another key thing to consider when it comes to the ethics is where the data came from. And one of the tragic things to come out of World War II, particularly from the concentration camps, was that a lot of doctors at those camps were doing some really cruel and unusual experiments on the prisoners there. And while it's quite easy to argue that the entire thing was bad, with a lot of people being killed by gas chambers and things like that, there was also a lot of people killed from what we would absolutely call now unethical experiments. And the key thing here isn't necessarily, okay, the experiments were bad, but when the war ended, the data from these experiments was sitting there in the notebooks of the doctors. Is it ethical to use that data? Because that data does provide information on human biology and on potential medical effects from that. And this is a really hard thing to answer because, one, that data shouldn't exist because it was done in just such a cruel, dehumanizing and nasty way. But could that data actually be used to help people? And there are things there. There are interviews with people whose parents died in the German concentration camps, and say, look, it's obviously tragic that their parents died, but they actually want the data to be used because it gives them some sort of solace, as to say that, well, even though my relative died, someone might be saved from the use of that data. And in saying that, not everyone's going to feel that way. Some people are going to say, no, you don't use it. And it's a really hard thing to say. Now, of course, this is an article written by someone who works in that there, who works in that ethical idea there as well. And of course, she also works in a thing with Children's Bioethics Centre. And that's also another thing there in terms of we've previously discussed. And also, in terms of informed consent and ethics, there are people who are becoming things called biohackers, who augment their body through technology. An infamous case in Australia in Sydney was someone who actually got a opal chip from the public transport system embedded into his hand so that he didn't have to carry a card or anything around. And there's a whole range there. Is that ethical? And that also raises a whole heap of things. This idea of what is a cyborg? Where, particularly in places like the United States, where artificial limbs are becoming robotic, and that there. And the ethical part of the ethical argument comes about is, well, what does it mean to be human anymore? If you've got a pacemaker, does that make you less human than someone who doesn't? And of course, as technology improves and we replace parts of our body more regularly, at what point are you more machine than human? And at what point does it actually matter? Particularly if people are able to develop things like artificial intelligence. At what point does that become sentient? At what point does that become its own life form? And the more you talk about ethics and the more you think about it and the more examples you get, the more muddy it actually gets as a concept. And of course, one of the things that this entire narrative presents here is that research, particularly at the cutting edge of science and the cutting edge of biological sciences, it isn't just about setting up for research. There are so many other things to consider. Briefly mentioned before about CRISPR technology, and there was a case where a Chinese doctor claimed to have used CRISPR to change some embryos' DNA, and a baby, or I think it might have even been twins, were born that were genetically modified via CRISPR. In most countries in the world, that's illegal, and the doctor was in China and apparently was arrested and thrown in jail. But eventually that technology is going to become more common. And this is where ethical issues come in. And you argue, well, doing a CRISPR genetic modification on a baby that might have a disease, is that ethical? So many arguments. And of course, as the cartoon suggests there, the scary thing is that maybe the difference between just doing standard genetic engineering and biological warfare is who's paying the money.